System Subcommittee along with Abby. So I am going to speak in a little bit more detail about the work of that group and some of our actions that have flowed out of the recommendations of the climate plan, since they really fall under the jurisdiction and purview of this subcommittee. And I'll try to go pretty quick and not repeat a lot of what Jane covered and leave time for Ryan and Abby, who are going to really dig into more of the agricultural aspects of our work. All right. There we go. Okay, so as Jane mentioned, the Global Warming Solutions Act had 4 subcommittees in statute, and science and data was added by the council at the time. The Ag and Ecosystem Subcommittee has a really broad charge. We're really looking at its highest level, maintaining the state's working farms, forests, and natural lands. They're a critical asset for the state to achieve all of the Global Warming Solutions Act goals and requirements. It's really what makes Vermont well positioned to adapt and be responsive to climate change and to store and sequester carbon. We looked at things ranging from actual field and forest practices to markets and economies, food systems, land use policy, regulation, legislation, incredibly education, incredibly broad suite of elements related to our landscape. And we did this because Vermont's landscape is critically important. You know, the vast majority of the state is currently in forest, agricultural, or natural state. We're somewhat unique in New England to have such an intact and ecologically connected forest. And it's, as Jane indicated, sequestering and storing, you know, a significant percentage of our carbon emissions each year. And the consultants who supported the Climate Council's work found that we need to roughly maintain that same level of storage and sequestration through 2050 if we're to achieve that net zero goal. Even if we implement all of the emissions reductions requirements in the act, if we don't keep the storage and sequestration provided by our landscape, we're going to fall short of that net zero requirement. And this is the who. This is the folks who volunteered their time largely to meet for a year plus, often every other week, at times even more frequent, to do this hard work. Abby is an amazing powerhouse. She has so many demands on her time, and she gave mightily to this effort. So, you know, it's great to hear from her today. And these are the other folks who were part of the group. Jake from the Sustainable Jobs Fund, who's been very involved in the Farm to Plate program. Judy Dow, an educator and Abenaki community member in Vermont. Charlie Hancock, who is a consulting forester in the northern half of the state. And then the GWSA was pretty innovative in that it required or provided the opportunity for a lot of youth participation. So we, both on the council and the subcommittees, and we had a range of different youth members participate over the 2-year period that we met. They had a range of different demands on their time, so they kind of cycled through, but it was great, really, really great to have that perspective. And I'd encourage you all to think about those sorts of participants and stakeholder groups going forward. We had David Mears from Audubon, Vermont, Lauren Oates from the Nature Conservancy, Ryan, who you'll hear from later, John Roberts, who was in his role with the Champlain Valley Farmers Coalition. He had to step off the group when he moved to run the USDA Rural Development Program, but it was great to have him for much of his time. And then Abby White, who's a soil scientist at UVM. And as I said, we met, you know, for the better part of 18 months, at least twice a month. And often more. We also created task groups and working groups within the subcommittee that met more frequently. And we developed these 8 pathways. And I'm not going to read these, you'll have access to these slides, but these were the high level pathways that we felt the state needs to pursue to achieve the goals of a ecologically connected, healthy agriculture and ecosystem to support both climate adaptation, resilience, carbon sequestration and storage, and just the sort of place that Vermonters are going to want to continue to live into the future. They hit on land use planning, regulation, economics, markets, food security, marrying all those things together through education, and providing the folks who own, manage land, their resources, and economic rewards to really continue to be good stewards, understanding they have done this work tremendously for centuries in Vermont, and we really rely on them for so much of what we have here. We need to figure out ways to sustain them going forward, seeing the increased importance of the work in the natural lands in Vermont. From those 8 pathways, we developed 43 different strategies, which were more specific avenues of action. And under those strategies, close to 200 specific actions. And these range from very high level, such as changes to the Act 250 land use policy, all the way down to field and farm practices, and even measures that individual residential landowners can take in their gardens and their lawns to help promote biodiversity and drive climate resilience. The group was pressed by me and others to try to kind of narrow and prioritize those recommendations, but to their credit, they said, no, all of this is important. We want to have all of our actions included in the plan and let it be a real roadmap and menu for policymakers going forward. So I'd really encourage you all to look at the agriculture and ecosystem section of the Climate Action Plan. It represents a great amount of work and it really is cross-cutting. I do want to point out that we did not have full consensus in those recommendations, that we did have one member who had issued a minority report effectively flagging some concerns with some of the recommendations and some deficiencies. So just wanted to make sure that that was known in this presentation. And all that's part of the Climate Action Plan. I encourage you to read it. And I'm just going to really quickly hit on some of our recommendations that are now either complete or in action. So you can see that the work that is underway to execute on the Climate Action Plan in this space. And Ryan and Abby will talk about more of the agricultural based ones. These are more cross-cutting and forest-based. But as Jane said, we did complete Vermont's first carbon budget, which is a really important science-based tools to show the volumes and metrics of carbon that is stored by our work in the natural lands. It's a real baseline for our work going forward. It's critical. We've stood up the Climate Action Office, expanded environmental justice efforts across state government. There's been significant investment through ARPA and other federal funds in the expanded buyout of floodplains, which is a resilience tool. Similarly, there's been significant ARPA funds invested in downtown and village water and wastewater infrastructure that's really needed to allow our existing settlements to grow and become more dense, and hope to take pressure off our more rural and undeveloped lands and prevent sprawl and really focus growth in the areas where we have kind of capacity and keep the pressure off the parts of the landscape we need for other uses. We've seen an increased investment in urban tree planting. We found that our more urban areas are really heat sinks during the summer and are often shadeless and really would benefit from shade trees to help be more resilient in the face of increased heat, but also to connect folks in those communities more to nature. So that was a really important action that happened in the last year. As Jane mentioned, there's been an expansion of the use value appraisal program to allow enrollment of lands managed for old forests. The state wetlands maps are currently being updated. That was another recommendation of our group. And then some really important work happening through VHEB's Vermont Farm and Forest Viability Program to provide direct technical assistance through service providers to forest landowners who are ready to consider estate planning or transferring their lands. As many of you likely know, 80% of Vermont's forests are privately owned. Many of those folks are nearing or at retirement age, and we're going to see a really significant demographic transition in ownership of much of Vermont's landscape in the next decade. And having people in place to guide those folks so that they can hopefully make decisions that work for them and their families, but also keep that land intact is really vital, and it's great to see that project moving forward. Similarly, VHCB, along with many of their conservation partners, is leading a really comprehensive conservation planning effort to look at what our baseline is around conservation, what science-informed goals we should pursue, and then what the kind of budget and programmatic gaps are in achieving those goals. So that effort is just underway now, and RFP is being issued for some facilitation services. And I'd encourage you to have those folks in to talk about that effort. Related, VHCB and our partners raised funds to have the Center for Whole Communities run an 18-month program for leaders in the conservation field to really challenge assumptions about equity and inclusion in land conservation, and to help those leaders understand the implications of their work and to really drive equity and inclusion in land conservation in Vermont and land access. Related, the legislature last year, as many of you likely know, created the Vermont Land Access and Opportunity Board at VHCB that is working with BIPOC communities to really try to understand ways to improve their access to land for a range of purposes. And then finally, there's ongoing consideration by the Vermont Climate Council around how biomass and wood fuel fits into our future. So this is really a high-level snapshot of the ongoing work that came out of the Ag and Ecosystem Subcommittee. I encourage you again to go back and look at the plan. There's really a great body of work there. And that's it for me. Try to keep it quick.
Oh, it was super fast.
Yeah, very effective.
So I will share these slides, and if anyone has any questions for me, I'm happy to answer them.
Yeah, are there questions?
No.
Yes, Representative Lipsy.
Billy, I'm going back 7 years. Bill McKibben came to Stowe, 300 people in the audience, and it was all wind and solar. And a lot of us weren't prepared to convert our homes, that the kind of capital developed those two systems. And I asked him how for the average Vermonter in our town community, wood heat was one thing they could do that was a renewable source. How did that fit in the greenhouse gas crisis we're in? He said, well, it's all solar and it's all wind. And I said, but you've got a room full of folks that would like to do something, but they don't have the resources, the economic resources to convert it. Is it good or bad? And he said, eventually, I said, so yes or no? And he eventually said, all right, burn wood. But it was with a lot of caveat. And you're focusing on the end on biomass and wood fuel, which there is particulate matter and other negatives from that. Where in this climate action plan that we're now engaged in with the chronology, do you still feel that has a place?
Sure.
If not ideal, where could you go a little deeper into how you feel?
Absolutely.
That is at this time.
Sure. So the initial climate action plan that was adopted last December, or 2 Decembers ago now, does recommend an approach to reducing thermal emissions from heating our homes and businesses that does include modern wood heat as an important strategy. So the Climate Council was very clear that Vermont, we have a long tradition of wood heat. There's been great advances in technology to heat space with wood, and that can and should be a central component in how we move forward into the future. That's not to say there may not be a time in the distant future when we can heat through other sources, but certainly that this initial climate plan acknowledges the important role wood heat can play. I think our subcommittee also acknowledged that for folks who are private owners of large acreage woodlots, to continue to be good stewards, to keep those lands in a natural or working state, to prevent subdivision and further development of that land, it's important to have access to value from your property. And you can derive that value from just the pure enjoyment of it, through improvements for wildlife habitat, or through the sale of forest products from your land that may be important to help you continue owning it. So the wood fuel market in Vermont is an important one for landowners to help maintain their lands and forests. So that's certainly something that we talked a lot about in our group and the council. The ongoing work at the Climate Council right now is more focused on electric generation from wood and what to do with the existing plants, the 2 plants in Vermont, and future proposals that might arise. There's some interest in some quarters to take up the question about thermal application of wood more broadly. I'm not sure that the council has the appetite for that right now. There's a lot of additional study that Jane mentioned, both from a life cycle analysis and some other analysis that's going to be conducted in the coming years that will really inform the role of wood in Vermont. So I think we should probably hold tight until that work is done.
Thank you.
Representative O'Brien.
This could be for Abby, Billy, Ryan. What were the discussions around on agriculture and forestry in that technology-wise, it seems like those are going to be the last areas where, because of diesel is so important there, there's going to be this conversion to electric. So like tractors, skidders, and even the weight of stuff hauled away from these places like log trucks and milk trucks, same problem. So was there a discussion about how agriculture and forestry is going to be sort of lagging behind in the success of this whole program?
Sure, and I'll let Ryan speak to that more detail, but I think absolutely there was, and I think even within the act, there's acknowledgement that we're not going to get at 100% renewable right off the bat, right? There's going to be some sectors and spaces that are still going to rely on fossil fuels for a period of time, and that kind of heavy duty sector is one that I think folks certainly had in mind.
Other questions for Billy? Okay, good. Well, thank you.
Thank you. Sorry to be quick, but trying to make some room for my friends here. So.
Should Abby go next? Because she's got a.
I was wondering the same thing. Is that, Ryan, is that all right if we let Abby, since she does have to jump off?
And she's got a cat in her lap. So what's your cat's name?
I was gonna say I'll just be wrestling with Luna while I talk to you. So, Ryan, are you sure that works? I don't. The reality for me is that Billy is amazing, and Ryan and Jane, and they allowed me to delegate all of the PowerPoints and things like that to them. And therefore, I have no PowerPoints or anything like that. I'll just talk for a few minutes if that works. And then if you have some quick questions for me, that's fine. I think a few things in light of what's already been shared, I want to make clear or bring forward is one of the interesting things that I think arose from this subcommittee in particular, the Agriculture and Ecosystem Subcommittee, was, sometimes we avoid hard conversations, and there was no avoiding hard conversations in this subcommittee. This is, typically kind of the environmental realm exists over here and the agricultural realm exists over here, and they very seldom have to speak to one another about how they're thinking about things, how they're moving ahead. But particularly, there's plenty of people in your room right now that can attest to this, in the next generations, the upcoming generations of farmers, those lines are not delineated in the ways that they sometimes historically have been. Farmers now have to be environmental stewards. They have to be thinking about things very differently because of the realities of a changing climate. I always find it really interesting when people are talking, there's a certain level of anxiety that you can sense in people, which is very, earned around the realities of climate change. But the fact is, for people who work in the natural world, this has been a reality of our existence for at least the last 10 years. Machinery changes, practice shifts, different nuances as to how we approach the ways that we're trying to both steward land and produce food through those processes. And I think that this subcommittee allowed for some really important conversations to begin around how we start to think about those things far more holistically than we previously have been. The other thing that I think came about in the discussions was, or that I want to share, is it has seemed to me that we sometimes think about agriculture and we don't somehow attach that to food production and feeding people. And And that perception causes some damage in terms of there can be a kind of antagonistic view of some agriculture. And I think, really bringing that back to the change in this committee that just happened of thinking about this as food resiliency is a really important shift as we move forward. As you heard about, we import an enormous amount of food into Vermont. And I think we need to really be thinking about that, because what I see as what was designated by the Just Transition Subcommittee as a frontline community member, right? Farmers are on the front lines of climate change. We have to live with these realities every day. We're also witnessing at the same time the lack of full community resilience around those of us who are still trying to grow food. So the systems rurally in this state to maintain all of what goes into trying to be a resilient person as you're attempting to navigate these changes in environment and weather and things like that are crumbling as well. I just sort of totally lost my train of thought there, but we want to really think about how are we going to feed people? What does that look like? How do we think about vehicle miles traveled, but in a way that not just electric cars, this is where I get a little on my soapbox, but also what are we doing to ensure that our communities are resilient within and unto themselves so that the vehicle miles aren't as necessary to be traveled? I always use the example of when I was a kid, the school bus picked me up at the end of the driveway. Now I have to drive my kids 20 minutes away to take them to school, or to take them 5 miles away to get on the closest bus to take them to school. We have, through policy in this state, set up systems that spread out our people or require our people to travel more than they previously did. Obviously, a lot of that is just, this is how the things have adapted. But I think we're at a moment where we need to think about what does it look like to try to reintegrate resilience into our communities on a smaller basis so that they have to travel less. And of course, food resilience is an enormous part of that. We actually do have food deserts in Vermont. In COVID, 1 in 3 people were food insecure. That was something that we talked about a lot. So I think when we're thinking about policy regarding agriculture, we have to start thinking about that too as policy regarding food and composting systems and, all of these higher level policy frameworks that we're thinking about as to how to help people make their way through this. Because as Mr. Graham rightfully pointed out, most of us are not in a position to remotely afford what is coming down the pike for us. And wages in Vermont are not growing, and there are all those realities. So I always, people are like, you're a farmer, you're not supposed to think about these things. Sure, but part of being an organic farmer is thinking about everything holistically. I don't have the ability, because of the regulations that are put on me as an organic farmer, to think about things in isolation. I have to approach all of the work that I do in any given day from a very broad, holistic framework. And so I think if we can start to approach some of our policy solutions in that regard, as we're thinking about climate, we're going to be that much better positioned to not only meet the requirements of reducing our emissions, but to also meet the needs of our human communities as they try to become more resilient and adapt to these massive changes that are ahead of us as extreme weather events increase. The other thing that I think as a farmer, I really need to bring forward, and certainly to the farmers in the room, I don't need to make this point, but I shall anyway. The farmers are not all right. We're not all right. The resources to do this work in organic dairy, we're not being paid cost of production. So, for me personally as a farmer, we are solar powered. Our farm is conserved. We haven't tilled anything in 40 years. Our entire farm is in perennial grasses, which is a far more resilient subsoil structure to hold water and maintain organic matter, which Ryan will get into. But we're going to go out of business if something doesn't change. And we've been here for 155 years. I'm the 6th generation. We also on our farm train some of the next generation. My father was the first certified mentor grazer to host the dairy grazing apprenticeship program, which is the only nationally accredited apprenticeship program in the country for farming. But, in thinking again holistically about this, and this is cross-sectoral, I'm married to a builder, so I hear about this all the time in that regard too. There's no workforce. The people that are needed to make all of these transformations happen, to install and upgrade homes to 200-volt systems, to shift over the infrastructure to electric vehicles, to make sure that we can adapt our natural and working lands, our agricultural lands, to the changes that are coming while simultaneously producing food. It's getting really difficult for those of us on the ground to know how to keep going. An anecdotal statistic is, Farm First, for example, I believe has seen like a 3 times demand in the requests for help from the farm sector for support for mental health. And so in the climate action plan, what you will see is places where you might think, what the heck does that have to do with climate? But I guess what I want to share, and I apologize for taking a soapbox stand to this, but we were really thinking in this committee about what would it look like, or how would we go about making changes so that people can thrive as we make these transitions. And we so infrequently, in agriculture at least, talk about the people and what is required of the people who have to do this work every day. And farmers are not encouraged to talk about what is required of them to get up and do this work every day and the challenges that they face. Because for my generation, when you're trying to raise kids and you have no childcare and you have to keep a farm going, and the environmental regulations are going up, and your food safety requirements are going up, and you're supposed to reduce your diesel fuel usage, and all of these things, there comes a point where, as we're seeing right now, we're losing farms at a rate and forest land at a rate that is frankly terrifying for the mandated requirements that we face with the net zero targets. And the last thing that I'll say is, I just lost my train of thought again. So that's where I'll leave you. And if you have any questions, feel free, and I'll let Ryan get back into the more technical aspects of this. I like to think of my role within this as the person who's trying to ground truth this. Policy is very often made in isolation of those who have to do it, have to do the work. And I mean that again, cross-sectorally. And I think that as Jane was talking about, trying to reframe how we're approaching these issues and really allowing for the voice of the community members in different sectors to come forward and share how they think this could work. How are you going to create good building policy or good building codes if you don't have builders at the table, for example? Things like that, as we're thinking about moving forward, I think become really critical in these moments when it needs to be a very active and reciprocal working partnership between agencies and the government. And for the record, I have had a very great experience working with all of these folks, but just want to say that I think we need to approach some of this differently. And I also think that the Global Warming Solutions Act, I'm one person and I represent 85% of Vermont's lands. 85% of our land are natural and working lands. And there's one person on the council tasked to represent the interests of those sectors. And I was very fortunate to specifically have Ali Kasiba and Billy Coster and Charlie Hancock to help me try to bring along the perspective of those in the forestry sector. But that's not, ultimately my area of expertise, although we do have significant forest land in our easement that we manage. It's very different. So I think it's important to reduce emissions, but as you've heard all of us say, we could reduce all of those emissions tomorrow and we would still be left to try to ensure that our communities could live here. And we need to be thinking about that too, as we're making policy moving forward. Thank you so much for having me today.
Abby, thank you.
Thank you.
for that perspective, yeah. And we know you need to jump off and we'll hear from you again at some point, I'm sure.
I have 4 minutes if anybody has a quick question. Or did I silence everybody effectively, which is the thing that I do.
I think maybe, well, I'm not sure you silenced us, but you left us with a lot to ponder. So rather than break that mood.
Can I have one?
Yes, yeah.
What's your email address? Because I would like to follow up with you on some things, because I love it.
We'll make sure that
We'll have that, okay, because I love
Yes.
everything you said, so thank you
Oh.
for taking the time.
Thank you. Yes, thank you so much for having me in, and I'm really excited to. I hope I can come back many times and we can have many more conversations. I'm really excited for the opportunity with so many new faces in the room and just thinking about things differently moving forward.
Great. All right, thank you. And why don't we move then to at least getting a bit of an overview from Ryan Patch.
Sure. Hey, before you get started, are you related to Nancy Patch?
I get that question a lot. I am not.
Okay. She's my county forester.
Oh, gotcha.
I just
Yep.
figured they're all in the same, okay, cool.
Great. I am going to share my screen or attempt to. Go. All right. So 15 minutes until we adjourn, and I have a bit more just for an overview. So I'm going to do my best to summarize the high level points, and I'm just right across the street at 116. So happy to come over and dig into any further details at the committee's convenience. For the record, my name is Ryan Patch with the Vermont Agency of Agriculture, Food and Markets, Agriculture, Climate, and Land Use Policy Manager, working on climate issues as well as Act 250, Section 248. Use value appraisal, other land use areas of interest like that. Billy already shared this slide, so stole my thunder, but no, it's good to reiterate where we stand, I think, within the state for the distribution of land use and management. Agriculture, as we know, at the turn, from the 1800s to the 1900s was around 70% agriculture. It has contracted about 12%. And there's about 500,000 acres in cropland and pasture today. And that's decreased about 220,000 acres since 1987. So agriculture continues to be in decline. As we unfortunately heard from Abby, is a continued crisis across all types and sectors of agriculture. And so this presentation is an attempt to identify the importance of agriculture and our agricultural soils, not just to climate change mitigation and resilience for both farms and neighbors in the state, but also the importance of agriculture for building a food system that we may need in the near future as climate disruptions affect the country and the world. Billy also already shared that, so thank you. If you want to be directed to some of the sections of the Climate Action Plan, the link is at the bottom of the slide. We'll post it on the committee page. And this identifies 3 areas that the Climate Action Plan represented, all of those pathways, strategies, and actions that Billy worked to summarize. Section 11.4 being the main agricultural pathways for mitigation, which is a main focus of this short presentation today. But as has been spoken to, it's an attempt to be holistic, thinking about adaptation and resilience, as well as the need for sequestration and storage to be part of agriculture's contribution to climate mitigation. Just as I know everyone is likely aware of climate change is happening. This is from the UVM climate assessment in 2021. The Green Mountain State is getting warmer. We're getting more precipitation, increased nearly 2 degrees with a 21% jump in precipitation. When you contrast this to the rest of the United States, this is from a presentation Ellen Kaler, Vermont Sustainable Jobs Fund, gave last year to this committee, identifying how climate change is predicted to impact different areas of the country differently. Where most of our food flows happen, you'll see the scarcity of water and heat stress and wildfires being of particular concern for the national production of our food and crops. Vermont, on the right-hand side here, has some precipitation averages that have been observed going back from 1900s through to 2020 or 2019. And as you can see, we are getting more precipitation, but it's not always in the months that we want that precipitation to happen. Episodic droughts are predicted to become more frequent. And so irrigation strategies and other water management is up front of mind for Vermont, but we are generally getting enough precipitation in most months to grow a saleable crop, though this past year we had significant droughts down in southern Vermont, which really affected farms. So climate change is here. It's affecting how farmers produce food across all types of different sectors, but Vermont is generally, in my view, better positioned to grow food into the future as water will likely be a limiting factor in other areas. Transitioning now to the production of food or crops, the next series of slides are just an attempt to illustrate the framework or the view from myself and the Agency of Agriculture about our soils. Our agricultural soils are incredibly important to steward as they provide a host of benefits, not just for climate, but for other ecosystem service valuations, what have you. On the left-hand side, you'll see the statistic. If you increase the percent of organic matter, that acre of soil can hold an additional 20 to 25,000 gallons of water. An acre inch of rain is about 27,000 gallons. So, if we get more precipitation, the ability for our soils to be more stable and hold that water in times of drought and to let it infiltrate in times of deluge is a really important facet of building and enhancing soil health in our agricultural soils. And further, if you look on the right-hand side, this is a slate test. You will see full width tillage on the left and no-till on the right. And you can see when you have those, that soil biology operating at a high level, those glues in the soil from, the microbes that are living there and aren't destroyed and pulverized on an annual or multi-annual basis are much better able to withstand the submersion water and reduce runoff, what have you. So very important concept I'm going to return to. Talking about resilience and flood resilience, Irene is definitely front of mind to major impacts that can happen from precipitation. On the left, you have increased organic matter. In the middle of this slide is a study that was done by UVM identifying the benefits of floodplains and wetlands above Middlebury that help protect Middlebury from damages. And the rightmost part of this slide is an analysis conducted by the agency. Farmers manage about 50% of the wetlands in that Otter Creek watershed. And so acknowledging while Middlebury had some, defrayed cost of human life and infrastructure, farmers bore the brunt of that flooding and silting of feeds and making them, an erosion, what have you. So there definitely are impacts and benefits, and farmers are often on the front line providing those ecosystem services and managing those floodplains. To try to underscore, I think, here's the big picture idea. Here's the concept as to why agricultural soils are so important to steward and elevate in a climate discussion. This is from the UVM soil health, the Vermont Survey of Soil Health that they did in 2021. And what we have here on the left is just representation that, there is already a lot of carbon in our soils. And from a long-term test or study that UVM Extension has been conducting, based on management, we can see an increase in organic matter year on year for at least 11 years. And so extrapolating the corn and hay production we have in the state and the ability to enhance the rate of soil health improvement through the funding of conservation practices on farms, increasing soil organic matter. Based on this study, over 900,000 metric tons of CO2 could be sequestered annually above what is already being provided by agricultural cropland. And that's the same as about 200,000 cars being removed from the road. We have about 190,000 residential cars registered in the state of Vermont. So enormous opportunity here for agriculture when you focus on the soils. To try to why I've been talking about soil health within the Global Warming Solutions Act, there's requirements for emissions reduction. There's requirements for net zero targets. There's a definition of mitigation, which kind of sews those two concepts together, both the reduction of emissions and the increasing rate of sequestration in our soils or above ground biomass, putting those two together in mitigation. And kind of going to be focusing on that as we move forward because agricultural land can provide both services, but also not leaving in isolation the concept of resilience, not just on farms and food production, but resilience of our food system, production and distribution, but then also the ability that agricultural fields can play in providing, resilience within a watershed to extreme weather events, as was evidenced by that study in Middlebury. More organic matter, more attenuation and storage of water. You can attempt to delay that hydrograph, and a well-managed ag soil can provide numerous benefits. So focusing on ag soils as the lens through which to explore both mitigation and resilience. How do we get there? Adaptation strategies through supporting the adoption of soil health conservation practices on farms. That was identified as a major win-win, co-benefits for a multitude of different categories. The most effective and commonly adopted conservation practices that are currently being utilized in Vermont: cover crop, nutrient management, conservation tillage, crop rotation, prescribed grazing, rotational grazing, interseeding, no-till. All of these practices, especially when they're stacked together on a farm, can provide significant benefit enhancements to organic matter, supporting not just the drawing of CO2 out of the atmosphere and storing it in the soil, but also that soil itself can be the sponge to absorb excess water, whether that's for improving crop production in times of drought, or, as I'll keep saying, providing flood benefit or attenuation in times of too much rain. To direct you to section 11.4 of the Climate Action Plan, and attempt to just weave some of the existing ag programs that are around and currently funded and administered at the Agency of Agriculture. You can see the recommendations in section 14, strategy 1, actions A through J, as well as section 14, pathway 2, trying to look at all of the recommendations that were put forward and trying to tie them to the existing ag programming that is there, whether it's our Farm Agronomic Practices program that provides cover crop financial assistance to implement cover crop, as an example, to Working Lands Enterprise Initiative, which can help support farm viability and improvements to technology and business innovation on farms as well. So trying to identify those programs that already exist that can be enhanced and were funded last year as part of the General Assembly's kind of climate response, an additional $4.76 million of ARPA dollars going to these ag conservation programs to support the implementation of conservation practices on farms. So how are farms doing, right? We identified some of those conservation practices that provide the co-benefit. Up until the Global Warming Solutions Act, the big focus for agriculture has been water quality. Act 64 of 2015, also known as Vermont's Clean Water Act, significantly upped the regulatory standards for farms to improve agricultural water quality outcomes, focusing on non-point source pollution from farms. This multi-agency federal-state partnership has resulted in the delivery of over $40 million of state dollars going to support the adoption of conservation practices on farms. And this is a representation of some of the most commonly funded conservation practices. What the state does in the water quality sphere is it takes those conservation practices, which are mapped on a geospatial basis, so we can know the soils that are there, the slope steepness, the proximity to surface water, et cetera, and share that with ANR and the Department of Environmental Conservation, and they come back with, okay, farmers implemented 300,000 acres of conservation practices since 2016. By year, these are the phosphorus reductions the state realizes from farmers adopting those conservation practices. And so this is from the 2022 Clean Water Investment Report. Agriculture has been responsible for over 95% of all the phosphorus reductions that have been reported by the state. It's really been an incredible movement on the part of farmers to adopt those practices. We've gone from about 7% cover crop adoption rate to 48%. So massive adoption implementation, and it's also the most cost-effective strategy. So I will stop here and say this is where the rubber hits the road as far as the Global Warming Solutions Act, and how do we leverage this existing framework that provides significant water quality benefit. How can we also track, account, and give credit for the climate co-benefits from those conservation practices? What we have here is the emissions inventory from the Global Warming Solutions Act, which uses a state inventory tool, and it's 16% of Vermont's total share. What it counts are enteric fermentation from ruminant animals, the management, the storage of manure, and the application of manure. What's not counted currently in the emissions inventory is that soil carbon exchange. And so this is kind of that breakdown. And as Jane spoke to, and I'm happy to come back and speak in more detail, focus on how we have an RFP out there, have a contractor identified to support further research in this area, because this is incomplete. All of that soil carbon benefit that farmers are doing cannot currently be counted in the current emission inventory. And so that, from the Agency of Ag's perspective, is a big miss. And so that is something that we're collaborating on with a lot of partners to better understand what is the right framework, set of modeling tools that meet international standards that will help the state count the benefits that we're getting from farmers' adoption of conservation practices. And I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Yeah, that's probably a good place to pick up when we have you come back in. So yeah, I'm sorry we're being summoned and
I understand. Yeah,
What's going on?
yeah. But yeah, no, thank you. And committee, we're done for the day. We'll be back here.
Okay, happy to.
Laura, what's our start time tomorrow?
And I hope to talk to you a lot more.
We're not here for
Absolutely.
10 tomorrow, so yeah.